Hi, it's good to see you again. We're in the middle of our 2 global outreach weekends here at Emmanuel Faith Community Church, and I'm really glad that you're tracking with us and hopefully learning along with us as we look each weekend at issues that have to do with the world in which we live and what God's doing to expand His kingdom and invite people of all nations and tribes and backgrounds into His family centered on Jesus that will live with Him throughout all eternity, and in the process transform our world to bring glory and honor to Him. This first weekend, we've been taking a look at what God's been doing in the Middle East, and we've been looking at and learning from examples of how the church in the Middle East is stepping into these unusual opportunities that God is bringing to them, not by their plan and probably not by their choice, in which they can be a part of sharing the good news of Christ through words and deeds with people who, in many cases, have never known much about Jesus Christ and have never had an opportunity to learn about Him. It's been challenging to think about the fact that God sometimes brings into our lives, just as He's doing with our Arab brothers and sisters, people that we maybe don't even like, people that have been very distant from us, maybe people that we have bad history with, for His eternal kingdom purposes. And it's been really encouraging to think about the ways not only in the Middle East, but the ways God is using people here in San Diego to do the same kind of ministry, reaching out and extend the love of Christ. I hope that you'll keep learning, you'll keep asking God questions as to how you can be a part of that story, not just far away through giving and praying for those in the Middle East, but how can we be involved locally? How can we be involved in our own neighborhoods, in our places of work, in the communities that God has placed us in right here in San Diego to do the very same kinds of things? Both people who are coming from other nations around the world, some under great duress, and maybe it's people who've grown up here their whole life, but who are on the margins, separated from the knowledge of Christ, and no longer feeling hope because of the life that they've been experiencing. Our hope is that through us taking steps of obedient faith, as our speaker the first weekend suggested, that we would be able to invite people into this family that God is building of all nations, so that people would no longer be strangers. People would find a home in Christ. Now, I want to kind of turn this just a little bit and tell you that on our second weekend, we're looking at this issue of what does it look like in a European context. And we have a speaker coming to us, actually two, one coming from the Netherlands and another speaker coming from Hungary, who are telling us about what they're seeing in Europe. And Europe is struggling through this, just as many parts of the world are, in learning how to understand and how to respond. And the church there is doing it, you'll hear if you're here around Emmanuel Faith this weekend, doing it perfectly and not so perfectly. There are cases where the church is struggling and some parts are ahead of others, just like we are here. And so we're going to be talking about this and figuring out what does the Bible have to say about that, and how can we step in, partner with, pray for, and learn from our European brothers and sisters. Because the reality is we live in a very globalized world today. In fact, today I have on me things that are made in El Salvador, in Mexico, Vietnam, China, and Japan. And I couldn't quite figure out where my sandals were made, and the list would be even probably longer. We live in a world that has literally shrunk in our lifetimes. It's much more connected and related to one another. And what happens in one part of the world is quickly and easily seen, maybe not as well understood, but we're aware of it in other parts of the world. And we have products and services that come from all over the world. And probably many of you who are watching this perhaps have even been to some of the countries that I just listed. So our world has gotten much smaller, and the sense then of being a neighbor is taken on a whole new context for us today. And one of the challenges we're trying to really lay before people over these 2 weekends, and I hope that you'll discuss this some in your small groups this week, is what does it look like to be a neighbor in this new globalized world? How do I understand that as a follower of Jesus, and how do I respond to that? Now, Jesus tells a parable in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, that's very, very familiar. It's the parable, we call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I'd like to encourage you in your small groups to read that passage. And I've got 3 questions I would suggest that you talk about in your groups, and think about them in a global context. Think about them in light of current events that are going on around the world. Here's the first question I would suggest. How did Jesus challenge or expand our definition of the word neighbor? When you read this story and you see what Jesus is saying here, Jesus is pushing back and challenging in response to the question that was posed to him, what does it mean to be a neighbor in the sense of the way Jesus means as one who knows and follows him and his kingdom? So talk about that a little bit. What do we mean when we even say the word neighbor? And if we say, as a follower of Christ, we want to be a good neighbor to people, what does that really mean? And how does Jesus expand or challenge our concept of that? Secondly, if in fact we live in a world that's now much more globalized and interconnected, and we are neighbors in a global sense, how does this teaching of Jesus, how does this parable of Jesus apply to the current refugee crisis? How does that affect and shape the way that we, as followers of Jesus, should be thinking and should be responding? Are there implications? Are there connections? Think about what it means as we live our lives and we see what's happening around us in the world today. Does the teaching of Jesus and the parable of the Good Samaritan have any relevance? Does it have any meaning for us in terms of how we understand it and how we respond to it? That'd be a great question to wrestle with and talk about in your groups. And here's a third question for you. What are the barriers to us who are living this kind of neighborliness? If we're seeking to be the kind of neighbor that steps in and sees the needs of people that God brings across our pathway, as this parable illustrates, what are some of the common barriers that would get in the way of us being willing to do this or being able to live our lives this way? Maybe in your own life, in your own community, in your own family, in the social circles that you travel in. What are some of the common things that seem to rise up that keep us from exercising that kind of proactive, loving, compassionate response that Jesus seems to be advocating here in Luke chapter 10? Our speaker the first weekend challenged us to think that way. And so I encourage you to talk about how you can live that out in your groups this coming week.